So today I want to talk about a kind of comedy that I'm often pretty confused by. This is comedy that I've kind of dubbed performance art stand-up, where there's really an absence of jokes. You know, the beautiful thing about stand-up comedy is that it is really young and it is without rules. I know this is something that we've talked about in the past, and if you're a comedian and what you want to do is make people laugh, the way you go about that is really up to you. In 2011, Tig Notaro was a guest on Conan, and she talked and she mingled and she kibitzed, and then she decided to push a stool around the stage for what felt like a very long time. It was probably 3 to 5 minutes.
I was performing in Seattle, and when I was on stage, I moved the stool next to me just slightly, and it made this weird noise. And it caused the entire audience to laugh collectively. And I was like, oh, that's all you guys needed? So I was just curious what you guys would think if I pushed the stool here.
I don't know if that's stand-up comedy, but I know that I laughed. My laughter in my home came and went when I watched it on YouTube, the same way that the studio audience's laughter came and went in the audience. So it worked. It worked. It worked.
If you want me to stop a couple of you, maybe it's because you haven't heard it enough.
While my generation probably knows him as the guy who walked out in the middle of an interview with Marc Maron on WTF, Gallagher is actually a very interesting example of a performance artist comedian.
Most comedians are terrible.
Okay.
They should listen to me.
If you're saying that a person that talks about themselves on stage is not a comedian, then you're dismissing a great many great comics.
Yeah.
You're
they
you're
did it wrong.
Now, sure, he had, I want to say, 14 full-length comedy specials, but what do we remember about Gallagher? It's the Sledge-O-Matic and the watermelons.
Help me to dispatch this melon. 1, 2.
Is that prop comedy? Sort of. Is it performance art? Sort of. Is it stand-up? I don't know. Is it vaudeville? Kinda. It's this weird thing, but the audience laughs, and so we accept it and we move forward. It's pretty weird that what one comedian is doing can be the same as what another comic's doing, even if their goals, the shape their comedy is taking, their style, their whole oeuvre, even if they're worlds apart. And today we're going to focus on one particular comedian who I frankly don't understand. There are days when I'm convinced he's a genius, and there are days when I'm convinced he's out of his gourd, and it kind of runs the gamut everywhere else in between. And he is Andy Kaufman. Now, I'm a classicist. My degree is in ancient Greek and Latin. I studied dead languages for a very long time in undergrad, and there's this ancient Greek philosopher named Diogenes, who I kind of think of in terms of Andy Kaufman. He used to carry around a lantern on a stick, and if someone asked him what he was doing, he said he was looking for an honest man. He used to do all these weird stunts. He would bring rotting fish to competitor philosophers' lectures to distract the audience. And he famously gave tons of lip to Alexander the Great and just kind of had a real irreverence for the world around him. And I see touches of that in comedians like Andy Kaufman, who seem like they're playing a game. They don't necessarily feel like they're presenting something. They feel like they're kind of playing this weird push and pull with the audience. Andy Kaufman did some really interesting things. He would take the entire audience out for milk and cookies after a show.
Well, I've hired, okay, now you've all been very good, really have. Okay, and I'd like to take you all out for milk and cookies now. So if you'll all please, in an orderly manner, there's 20 buses out waiting for you outside.
Or he would sing the entire 100 bottles of beer on a wall song to an audience, or if he was very angry at an audience, he would proceed to pull out an old paperback and read the entire Great Gatsby until no one was left in the audience.
So anyway, it's called The Great Gatsby. It's by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and here it is. Chapter 1. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I...
The thing about Andy Kaufman is the joke really isn't on anyone but the audience. You know, if you're in an audience and you came to see a comedy show and someone is reading the entire Great Gatsby to you, sorry buddy, but the joke is on you. And Andy Kaufman is the one who is laughing. That's part of what makes him so weird, is he's kind of reversed a lot of the rules of the art form because he's doing it for himself. One of the things I've heard about Andy Kaufman over and over again is people saying that he's the only comedian who doesn't care if the audience is having fun. Now, there's a million ways to try and define stand-up comedy, but I think one of the most interesting and most compelling stipulations is that stand-up comedy evolves based on the response that the audience is giving back. If an audience laughs at dirty jokes, the comedian's probably going to tell a few more dirty jokes. If the audience laughs at more local humor, the comedian's going to lean into his local humor and try and mine that for all it's worth. But that's part of what makes Andy Kaufman so fascinating, is that he doesn't ever really seem to care. Another thing about Andy Kaufman is that he uses characters, but not in the sense that we've talked about before, not in the traditional sense where the character kind of blurs into their personality. You know, we're not always sure where Andrew Dice Clay ends and Andrew Clay Silverstein begins. I don't really know who Paul Rubens is, and I don't really know who Pee Wee Herman is, but I know kind of where they meet. Andy Kaufman is altogether different from that. He had a few characters, namely Latka, who he performed as on the TV show Taxi.
There's only one thing you need in life and to make you happy, and that is friends.
And Tony Clifton, who would sometimes open for Andy Kaufman.
How you doing? All right. Nice to see everybody out here. Everybody feeling good? All right.
But these were characters that he kind of put on like clothes. Sometimes he would be hanging out with his friends in not a performative situation, and he would just be Tony Clifton for the day. Or he'd walk down the street as Latka and just kind of live in these different spaces, live in these different personas. And that's kind of what we've been talking about all along here, is Kaufman did it for himself. He didn't do it for the audience. Sometimes there just happened to be an audience, and sometimes there happened to not be an audience. Andy Kaufman kind of pushes that to the extreme, and he doesn't obey traditional rules of performance or traditional rules of social interaction. He is who he woke up as, and that's who you're going to have to deal with if you're meeting with him today. Andy Kaufman never really claimed to be a comedian. In all honesty, it's kind of a term of convenience, and a lot of scholars believe that he kind of took the anti-meta comedy of comedians like Steve Martin or Albert Brooks, and he turned it into something altogether different, like anti-entertainment. He didn't always want you to have a good time. For example, when he's scream crying and playing the bongos on HBO, I don't know who he's doing that for. One of Andy Kaufman's most successful acts in the early days of his career was this kind of stunt that he did where he's effectively hustling the audience. He'd come on stage and do a series of bad impressions as the foreign man, aka Latka.
So first, I would like to imitate Archie Bunker. You stupid! Everybody's so stupid. I would like to imitate the Elvis Presley.
He would do this kind of shockingly good impression of Elvis after the string of bad ones, and the incongruity perceived there caused laughter in the audience. It was a game. It was a hustle.
Well, it's a one for the money, two for the show, three to get ready now, go carry on, but don't you step on my boots, me and you.
Well, you can do anything from the bill from a blue suede shoe.
In my opinion, a lot of Andy Kaufman's jokes are funnier in theory than they are in practice. Do I want to listen to him sing 101 Bottles of Beer on the Wall? No, I don't. Do I think it's kind of badass that he did that? Yeah, I do, and I can laugh at the concept of that very far from the theater where it's happening. Andy Kaufman appeared on the very first episode of SNL in the 70s, where he came on and lip-sync with the theme to Mighty Mouse.
And here's this mighty sound. Here I come,
George Carlin later wrote of Andy Kaufman, "Oh, well, of course. It was just another sign that free spirits and oddballs can be rewarded." Some of his strangest and inaccessible exploits come from the years that he spent wrestling women. A lot of people often joke that while comedians contemporary to Kaufman grew up watching Robert Klein or George Carlin, Andy Kaufman was inspired by professional wrestlers and children's television show hosts. And I think that there's a lot of truth in that, actually. But Kaufman wanted to wrestle, knew he couldn't really do it, and so he decided to wrestle women. Strange decision, but there you go. By the end of his career, Andy Kaufman really couldn't get booked anywhere except for Letterman. He'd been effectively kicked off SNL through a voting system where the audience kind of agreed that they had had enough. He started developing a really persistent cough in the early 80s, and he died very quickly from a cancer that kind of snuck up on him. And due to his lifelong devotion to meditation and spirituality, he didn't really seek out traditional Western medicine. He decided to go other routes, and he seemed to disappear as quickly as he had appeared on the scene. And you know, there are people out there who love to joke that maybe Donald Trump is an Andy Kaufman character. Sometimes it feels just absurd enough to be true. And you know, some of his Taxi co-stars have always joked about how they wouldn't put it past him to appear one day. But if we're going to leave this discussion of Andy Kaufman anywhere, I want to leave it on the idea of fun. Andy Kaufman was a performer who performed for himself, and he didn't really let anyone else stand in his way. When he was up there on stage, he did what he felt like he wanted to do. And there's a beauty in that, and I think that even though we don't always agree with his methods or his execution, there's an innocence behind what Andy Kaufman is doing that I think a lot of comedians nowadays can learn from. He did stunts, he did performance art, and he had a hell of a good time doing it.
In this friendly, friendly world, with each day so full of joy, why should any heart be lonely?
Even if he's too inaccessible, trust me in the heart that I can't help but find behind what Andy Kaufman was doing.
We're just listening for his call. Here I come, save the day. That means that Mighty Mouse is on the way.
Okay everybody, that's the weird, wonderful world of Andy Kaufman. A long time ago I made some more videos about him if you want to check that out, because he is very strange and very fascinating. But go ahead, like, subscribe, comment, all that weird stuff. Let me know if you hate Andy Kaufman. I don't even care. Let's talk about it. And if there's someone else that you want to see or hear me talk about, don't be afraid to comment that down. But it's been a pleasure, and I'll see you guys in a bit. Bye.